This edition of Nation Talk is being brought to you by Scotiabank. Respecting your past, trusting your future. Think what we can achieve together.
Hello, listeners. This is Nick Ashulasega. Today we're being joined by Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne. Many of you will be familiar with Premier Wynne, who has also joined us in the past through her role as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. But thank you for being able to make some time for our audience, Premier, and how are you doing today?
It is my pleasure. Thanks, Nick. I'm doing just fine, and I hope you are too.
Wonderful. Yes, no, exciting times, of course, happening. But, let's just get right into it.
You and I were talking about the AFN election, so that's been a pretty exciting thing for the community.
Yes, no, definitely. It's going to be some exciting times, of course, too, politically, and I think relationship-wise as well, too, as, there's a lot of work to be done, of course, between, obviously, provincial, federal, and even municipal governments, and it seems like, the AFN, they have to do a lot of good work, and, they've been doing some good work in the past, and continuing the good fight, of course, right? So, actually, it brings me to my first point as well, Premier Wynne. What is Ontario's whole-of-government approach, essentially, to Aboriginal issues?
Well, I think the whole of government approach really expresses it. It's that right across government, I have an expectation that all of my ministers will work in whatever area, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's transportation, whether it's the environment, that all of my ministers will work in collaboration and with respect with the First Nation and Métis communities, and will work to create prosperous, healthy, and strong communities. That's the goal. We want to make some real progress, Nick, in making sure that we integrate Aboriginal policies with initiatives across government, because I want to see some real outcomes. I want to see, young Aboriginal kids doing better in school. I want to see more economic development within Aboriginal communities and more First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people, quite frankly, involved in the economic prosperity of the province. In November, we had here the Leaders in the Legislature event, and a number of ministers from the Cabinet discussed the issues with Chiefs of Ontario that were relevant to their priorities and mandates. And 13 of our ministers have a direct and explicit task in their mandate letters to work with Aboriginal communities and make sure that the Aboriginal communities are considered as they implement their policies. So we're trying very hard to build on the good relationship that we've established and improve it.
Well, you definitely have your finger on the pulse there, and it sounds like you're trying to implement a lot more accountability as well, too, which is incredible, of course.
I wanted people to know that our ministers had the job of working in collaboration and building those relationships.
Well, I know we're definitely going to be getting a lot done, of course, with a great leader like yourself. And, it actually brings me to the next point, which I know is a very touchy subject and a hard subject for many, of course, the murdered and missing Indigenous women. Maybe you can put your take on that as well?
Well, let me just start by saying that I'm personally, and our government's really very troubled by the high rates of violence against Aboriginal women and girls, and it's something that when I went to meet with the other premiers, when I was first in this role, I was very supportive of the Aboriginal community's call for an inquiry, and I have continued that position, and the Council of the Federation, Canada's premiers, have come on side with that. So there was a joint working group that was established in 2010, and that includes representatives from 5 Aboriginal organizations, 10 ministries, and it was set up to ensure that there was a long-term prevention strategy in place to reduce violence against Aboriginal women and their families. And the next meeting of that group is actually in February or March of 2015. So that group has been actively working to put in place a strategy. But I think we need to do more than that. We're going to continue to support the National Aboriginal Organization's call for the federal government to hold a public inquiry. We're also going to be part of a roundtable that the Premier is working with the Aboriginal organizations are going to be putting on in February or March of this year. It's a little unclear what the date is going to be, but we have asked federal ministers Kelly Leitch and Bernard Valcourt to take part. And, I think that even if the federal government won't do an inquiry, I think that there are things that we could do together, and that's why we need to have this roundtable. So I'm going to continue to support the call for the inquiry, but I want us to get an action plan in place.
Well, of course, again, obviously, actions are what's definitely going to be needed, I think, from that area, and it's great to hear that that's what the Ontario government is focused on, and again, implementing it as well, too. Which, of course, another area that I would like to get the government's take on would be treaty awareness. So what would be the Ontario government's take on treaty awareness?
Well, my first take on it, Nick, is that it is very important that we recognize that there is not enough awareness of treaties in Ontario, in my opinion. The fact is that when I went through school, when my children went through school, we were not taught the history that would have included the relationship with First Nations and Aboriginal people. And so we, as a government, we recognize that these are very relevant agreements. We recognize that we have a role as a treaty partner with the federal government and the Aboriginal signatories. It was interesting when I traveled to KI just recently with the Countess of Wessex and the Lieutenant Governor and a group of women, it was very clear to me that we need to do a much better job explaining to people what treaties are and how they work. So I've directed our government to develop a new treaty strategy. We've put in place $7.9 million over the next 3 years to be able to facilitate a constructive discussion and engagement on the relationships, promote improved socioeconomic outcomes for Aboriginal people, and engagement on the treaties, because that's what it means in 2014 that Aboriginal people in Ontario, First Nations people in Ontario, have the opportunity to be part of what is rightfully their place as treaty people, as we all are.
Definitely, and of course, you touched upon the education aspect as well, too, there, and I think that's something that could have, from both sides of the gambit, where people can definitely, I think, take a little bit more time, again, as you mentioned, with the awareness levels.
We are changing our curriculum, because my belief is that it is very important that First Nations and Aboriginal kids understand treaties and they understand the history. But as important or even more important is that everybody else does, I mean, all the kids in our schools need to understand. And I used the example, I was just at the Chiefs of Ontario dinner the other night, and I gave the example of my grandchildren whose father is Cree, that my grandchildren are in a school where there are very few Aboriginal kids, if any. I don't know whether there are any other kids. And, they're going to be learning history in the same way that everybody else is. And I want my grandkids to see themselves and their kukum and their moshum reflected in the curriculum. I want them to know who they are, just like I want every child who is living in this country to see themselves reflected in our curriculum so that they understand where they fit. So treaty education and treaty awareness are very, very important to me and to our government.
Wonderful. And for those who have the pleasure of catching this online too, we'll make sure to include some links below as well. So again, thank you so much for taking the time today, Premier Wynne. Before we let you go, maybe some last words of wisdom for the audience.
Well, I don't know whether I've got words of wisdom, but what I will say is that it is very important to me, even though we will have moments where we disagree. I've had the great privilege since I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and now as Premier to meet with Aboriginal leaders quite regularly every year. I meet with the Chiefs of Ontario. I meet with the other Aboriginal organizations organizations. I traveled to Thunder Bay and met with ONWA, so the Ontario Native Women's Association. I went to their AGM, and it was the first time in 43 years that a premier had ever attended the AGM for ONWA. And I'm going to continue to do those things because those relationships are very important if we are going to basically rewrite history and tell the story of this country and this province in a much more honest way, and that's my objective. So all the best, and miigwech for having me on.
Well, there you go, listeners. Thank you very much for taking the time again, Premier Wynne, and miigwech.